Elizabeth is the first child of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth. King George VI, in turn, is the second child of King George V. The Queen was born on April 21, 1926, at her father's residence on 17 Bruton Street in London. On May 29th, she was baptized by Archbishop Cosmo Lang in a small church at Buckingham Palace. Her godparents included her paternal grandparents, as well as her aunt, uncle, and other relatives. During her childhood, she was affectionately called Lilibet. In 1929, during King George V's severe illness, Elizabeth's frequent visits to his side had a positive impact on his morale. Elizabeth had a younger sister named Margaret, born in 1930. Both sisters received a good family education through the care of their mother and their nanny, Marion Crawford. In 1950, Crawford wrote a memoir titled The Little Princesses, detailing Elizabeth's interest in horses and dogs, her behavior, and her sense of responsibility. However, the publication of the book did not sit well with the royal family. Positive opinions about Elizabeth later echoed from others. Winston Churchill considered the future queen as a spirited and characterful child. Margaret Rhodes, the daughter of Elizabeth's uncle, described her as a cheerful and very intelligent girl. Individuals eligible to inherit the throne and crown included her uncle, Edward V, her father, George VI, and Elizabeth herself. While Elizabeth, as a member of the royal family, garnered attention in society, she never entertained the idea of becoming queen. In 1936, when her grandfather, King George III, passed away, her uncle, Prince Edward VIII, ascended to the throne with the title of King Edward VIII. After Edward's abdication, her father, Prince Albert, assumed the throne as King George VI. As Elizabeth was not a male heir, she became the second in line after her father. Following the firm stance of the government and the Church of England, her uncle chose marriage over the throne. Elizabeth's father was proclaimed king, and she, in turn, assumed the title of Her Royal Highness Princess Elizabeth as the heiress. Elizabeth received constitutional history lessons from headmaster Henry Martin at Eton College and began learning French to communicate with her nanny. Later, she became a student at this private school, specially established to provide her with interactions with peers of her age. In 1939, Elizabeth's parents embarked on official visits to Canada and the United States, mirroring the journeys her parents made to Australia and New Zealand in 1927. Believing Elizabeth was too young for such travels, her father, who had now become king, bid farewell to her with tears in her eyes. While her family was away, Elizabeth remained in London, maintaining communication through letters. On May 18th, her family established the first transatlantic telephone line for her. In 1951, the health of King George II began to deteriorate, and Elizabeth frequently stepped in for public engagements on his behalf. In October 1951, during a tour of Canada and a visit to President Harry S. Truman in Washington, D.C., her private secretary Martin Charteris carried a draft accession declaration in case of the king's death during the tour. In early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip embarked on a tour of Australia and New Zealand through the British colony of Kenya. On February 6, 1952, following a night at the Treetops Hotel, they had just returned to Sagana Lodge in Kenya when news of George VI's death and Elizabeth's immediate ascension to the throne reached them. Philip delivered the news to the new queen, who chose to retain the name Elizabeth for her reign, becoming Sarai Elizabeth, a designation that unsettled many Scots, as she was the first Elizabeth to rule in Scotland. Proclaimed queen, she hurriedly returned to the United Kingdom, and Elizabeth and Philip moved to Buckingham Palace. Upon Elizabeth's ascension, there was speculation that she would take on the name of the Duke of Edinburgh, following the tradition of a wife adopting her husband's surname during marriage. Lord Mountbatten advocated for the name Mountbatten House. Philip suggested Edinburgh House after his dukedom. Prime Minister Winston Churchill and Elizabeth's grandmother, Queen Mary, preferred the continuity of the Windsor dynasty, prompting Elizabeth to issue a statement on April 9, 1952, confirming that the royal house would continue to be known as the House of Windsor. Philip complained, "I am the only man in the country not allowed to give his name to his own children." In 1960, the Mountbatten Windsor surname was accepted for male line descendants without royal titles. During preparations for the coronation, Princess Margaret informed her older sister that she intended to marry the divorced Peter Townsend, 16 years her senior, who had 2 sons from a previous marriage. Elizabeth requested they wait for a year, with her private secretary stating, "The Queen naturally had a sympathy for the princess, but I hoped, if time were given, the affair might sputter out." Senior politicians opposed the match, and the Church of England did not permit remarriage after divorce. If Margaret had married Townsend, she would have had to renounce her inheritance rights. Ultimately, Margaret decided to abandon her plans with Townsend. Despite the death of Queen Mary on March 24, 1953, the coronation proceeded as planned on June 2nd, as she had requested before her passing. The coronation ceremony at Westminster Abbey, broadcast on television for the first time except for the anointing and communion, featured the emblems of Commonwealth countries embroidered on Elizabeth's coronation gown, a directive she gave to celebrate the Commonwealth. On November 24, 1992, in a speech commemorating the approaching anniversary of her ascension to the throne, Elizabeth coined the term annus horribilis, Latin for horrible year. This expression referred to the rising Republican sentiments in Britain, conflicting estimates of Elizabeth's private fortune in the press, and strained relationships within her extensive family, exacerbated by tumultuous marriages. In March, her second son, Prince Andrew, separated from his wife Sarah. In April, her daughter Princess Anne divorced Captain Mark Phillips. In October, during a state visit to Germany, Elizabeth was pelted with eggs by angry demonstrators in Dresden, and in November, a major fire broke out at Windsor Castle, one of her official residences. These events subjected the monarchy to increased criticism and public scrutiny. In an unusually personal speech, Elizabeth acknowledged that criticism is expected for an institution, but suggested it could be done with a touch of humor, gentleness, and understanding. 2 days later, British Prime Minister John Major announced a series of reforms in royal finances, including Elizabeth paying income tax and receiving a reduction in the civil list from 1993 onwards. In December, Prince Charles and Princess Diana officially separated. At the year's end, Elizabeth took legal action against the Sun newspaper for copyright infringement, as they published the text of her annual Christmas message 2 days before it was officially released. The newspaper had to pay compensation and donate $200,000 to a charity. Elizabeth's lawyers had previously settled a similar copyright infringement case against the Sun 5 years earlier for publishing a photograph of her daughter-in-law, the Duchess of York, and granddaughter Princess Beatrice. This case was resolved with an out-of-court settlement requiring the newspaper to pay $180,000. On September 8, 2022, at 15:10, Chairperson Elizabeth passed away at the age of 96 in Balmoral Castle, Scotland, where she was under observation. Buckingham Palace announced her death to the public at 1830. Elizabeth became the first English monarch to die in Scotland since V. James in 1542. The death certificate recorded old age as the cause of death. On September 12th, Elizabeth's coffin, with the Scottish crown placed upon it, was ceremonially carried through the Royal Mile to St. Giles Cathedral. The coffin was guarded by the Royal Company of Archers and rested in the cathedral for 24 hours, during which approximately 33,000 people passed by. On September 13th, the coffin was transported to London by air. On September 14th, a military procession carried the coffin from Buckingham Palace, where Elizabeth had lain in state for 4 days, to Westminster Palace. An estimated 250,000 people, including politicians and other notable figures, passed by the coffin. On September 16th, Elizabeth's children stood guard around the coffin, and the following day, her 8 grandchildren did the same. Elizabeth's funeral took place on September 19th at Westminster Abbey. This marked the first time since 1760, during the funeral of George II, that a monarch's funeral was held at the Abbey. September 19th was declared a public holiday in several Commonwealth countries. In Windsor, a final procession was held with 97,000 witnesses and the participation of 1,000 military personnel. Elizabeth's fallen horse and 2 royal corgis stood alongside the procession. Following the ceremony, the coffin was taken from Westminster Abbey to Wellington Arch and then to Windsor, with a ceremonial procession. Elizabeth's remains were transferred to St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and laid to rest after the burial ceremony.